You know that feeling when you check your account balance and for a second you're not totally sure the number is real, like maybe the app glitched somehow, or somebody added an extra digit in by mistake. Priya had that exact moment last spring, not because she got a windfall, because she'd quietly crossed a line she never knew existed. One month, her portfolio grew by more than she'd contributed all year. The next month, it happened again. Here's the number that should stop you mid-scroll. There's a specific point where your portfolio's own growth becomes larger than the money you're personally putting in, and for most steady savers, it arrives years earlier than they assume, with zero notification when it happens. This isn't a video about a trap. It's a video about a genuine turning point almost nobody notices while it's happening, and how to figure out roughly how close you already are to it. Let me show you the math. My name is Alex, and today on Wealth Adjacent, we're talking about the day your money starts working harder than you do. Quick disclaimer, not financial advice, just the math on how compounding actually behaves over time. Let's meet Priya. Mid-30s, decent but unremarkable salary, has been contributing to her retirement account consistently for about 12 years. Never maxed it out, never had a dramatic year. Just steady, boring contributions, month after month. Financial writers sometimes call this the crossover point. It's the moment your portfolio's own growth, just the market doing what markets do, becomes larger in dollar terms than what you personally contribute in a year. Say you're putting in $12,000 annually, $1,000 a month, genuinely realistic for a lot of people. Early on, your account grows almost entirely because of you. You put in $12,000. The market adds maybe $400 in a decent year. Your own contribution is doing nearly all the work. Here's the part that should make you sit up. Compounding is sneaky, because for a long stretch, it looks like almost nothing is happening. Then, without any specific moment marking the shift, it looks like everything is happening at once. Once a portfolio reaches a certain size, the math flips. Say Priya's account has grown to $300,000. In an average year, that portfolio might grow by roughly $21,000 from market returns alone, completely separate from anything she personally added. The market is now out-earning her own paycheck contributions. That's the crossover point. And here's what surprises most people about it. It isn't one universal dollar figure. It's the relationship between what you're contributing and what your existing balance can generate on its own. For some people, that lands around $250,000. For someone contributing more aggressively, it might be closer to $450,000. But most consistent savers cross it somewhere in that general range, and almost nobody notices exactly when, because there's no notification for it. No email from your retirement provider saying, "Congratulations, you've officially crossed over." It just quietly becomes true, sometime in a year you weren't paying especially close attention. That's honestly one of the stranger parts of investing. The biggest turning points in a financial life often don't feel like turning points while they're happening. You only recognize them looking backward, and most people never actually check, because almost nobody separates how much of their account's growth came from them versus how much came from the market. That single distinction is basically the whole story of financial independence, compressed into one number most people never calculate. Let's make this concrete with a second example, because abstract numbers slide right off the brain. Picture a couple in their late 30s, combined income solidly middle class, nothing flashy. They've contributed around $18,000 a year between the two of them for about a decade, and their combined retirement accounts sit around $260,000. In a modest, unremarkable 8% year, nothing spectacular, their portfolio grows by roughly $20,800, more than their entire annual contribution. They didn't do anything different that year. No promotion, no dramatic budget overhaul. Their money simply reached the size where an ordinary year does more than a full year of their own saving. It's worth naming the mechanics plainly, because they matter more than the feeling behind them. Compound growth works on percentages, not flat dollar amounts. A 7% return on $50,000 is $3,500. The same 7% on $400,000 is $28,000. Identical percentage, wildly different dollar impact. Contributions, meanwhile, tend to grow much more slowly, roughly tracking income, creeping up gradually, rather than compounding. Early on, a small base means 7% doesn't amount to much. Later, that same 7% becomes enormous in dollar terms, simply because the base underneath it has grown enormous. This is exactly why the first $100,000 is famously the hardest. And it's not motivational language, it's mathematically true. Growing from 0 to 100,000 relies almost entirely on contributions, because the market's share of that growth is small relative to the total. Growing from 400,000 to 500,000, a meaningful chunk of that can come from returns alone, given a few years to work. Depending on the return assumption used, a portfolio can spend roughly 2/3 of its total growth journey being driven mostly by contributions, with the remaining stretch driven mostly by compounding, which means the boring middle years, the ones that feel like nothing is happening, are usually exactly when the engine is quietly being built. There's a common myth worth clearing up directly. A lot of people assume that once they hit a big number, they can basically stop contributing and coast. That's not quite right. Crossing this point doesn't mean contributions stop mattering. It means they stop being the only thing that matters. Continuing to add fuel to a fire that's already burning well on its own is how someone reaches real financial independence faster, not slower. There's a psychological shift worth naming too, and it may matter more than the math itself. Before the crossover point, market drops feel personal. A 15% drop on a $60,000 account is a $9,000 hit, and it can feel like a genuine gut punch, especially when a meaningful share of that was money worked for, dollar by dollar, out of paychecks that already felt stretched thin. After the crossover, something different tends to happen. A 15% drop on a $400,000 portfolio is a $60,000 swing, a bigger number in absolute terms, and yet a lot of people report feeling calmer about it, not more anxious, because they've internalized that the growth engine is larger than any single year's noise, and they've watched the account recover before. This is also where people tend to start making steadier decisions almost automatically. Panic selling during downturns becomes less tempting once someone understands a temporary dip doesn't erase compounding already baked into a larger base. Chasing complicated products, promising to beat the market, loses its appeal once the simple, boring portfolio that got someone here reveals itself to be the same one that'll get them further. Many people also start reconsidering their relationship with work itself around this point, not necessarily quitting, but recognizing their paycheck is no longer the only thing standing between them and financial security. The portfolio has become a quiet second earner, working in the background regardless of whether anyone shows up to the office that day. There's a quieter shift worth naming too, one that shows up less in spreadsheets and more in daily decision-making. People who've internalized the crossover point tend to spend less mental energy relitigating every purchase decision against their long-term goals, since a meaningful share of that goal is now being carried by a mechanism running independently of any single month's spending choices. That doesn't mean spending becomes unlimited or unconsidered. It means the psychological weight of any individual decision shrinks slightly, because the entire financial picture no longer rests on that one choice the way it might have earlier in the process. So if this crossover point is a genuine turning point, the obvious question is how to reach it sooner rather than just waiting. The first lever, and it's not glamorous, is savings rate, not investment selection, not market timing, not a clever strategy from a headline. Simply the percentage of income actually being put away. Someone saving 20% of income reaches the crossover meaningfully faster than someone saving 10%. Even with identical investment choices, because a higher savings rate does two things simultaneously. It builds the base faster and lowers how much the portfolio actually needs to outperform for the math to flip. The second lever is time in the market, not timing the market. A phrase repeated so often it's become a cliche, precisely because it's stubbornly, boringly true. The compounding that creates a crossover point needs years to actually compound. Someone starting at 25, with modest, unglamorous contributions, often crosses this threshold years before someone starting at 35, with larger contributions, purely because of the head start those extra years provide. The third lever, frequently underrated, is keeping a portfolio simple enough to actually stick with through the boring stretches. A diversified, low-cost approach held through 15 years of market noise will usually outperform a complicated, fee-heavy approach abandoned after 18 months because a rough quarter felt scary. Simplicity isn't just about ease, it's a performance strategy in disguise. Because statistically, the best portfolio is the one someone actually stays invested in. There's a fourth lever worth naming, easy to overlook: reducing unnecessary fees and drag on an account. It doesn't sound exciting. Nobody daydreams about expense ratios, but a portfolio quietly losing an extra % a year to fees needs a noticeably larger balance to reach the same crossover point, simply because a portion of every year's growth gets skimmed off before it ever has the chance to compound. Checking fees once a year takes about 10 minutes and can meaningfully shorten how long this entire process takes. Here's a practical step worth running this week. Take your current portfolio balance and multiply it by a conservative long-term return estimate, something like 6 to 7%. Compare that dollar figure against what you contribute annually. If the market growth number is already close to your contribution number, you're near the threshold, whether you realized it or not. If there's a large gap between them, that gap tells you exactly what to focus on, usually meaning increasing savings rate remains the fastest available lever, more than picking a different fund ever will. A few additional practical moves fall out of that same calculation. Redo it once a year, not because the underlying concept changes, but because both sides of the comparison, balance, and contribution shift as income and market conditions move. Treat the estimate as a range rather than a precise date, since a 6% assumption and an 8% assumption can produce meaningfully different timelines from the exact same starting numbers. And resist the urge to check the calculation obsessively, since this is a multi-year process by nature, and a monthly or weekly version of this exercise mostly just adds anxiety without adding useful information. It's worth being honest that this isn't guaranteed on any specific timeline. Market returns vary meaningfully year to year, and a genuinely rough stretch can delay the crossover point regardless of how disciplined the contributions have been. This is a directional framework worth understanding, not a fixed date to count down to. Now, let me address a couple of objections directly, because I hear them every time this topic comes up. First, isn't this just survivorship bias? Doesn't this framework only work if the market cooperates over the specific years someone happens to be investing? Fair, and worth taking seriously. Long-run historical averages smooth out a lot of individual bad stretches, but nobody gets to live inside the average. They live inside their own specific sequence of years. That's exactly why the crossover point is best understood as a range to estimate roughly, not a precise date to plan a resignation around. The math describes a tendency across long periods, not a guarantee for any single person's exact timeline. Second objection. Doesn't this framework only really work for people with stable, well-paying jobs who can consistently contribute in the first place? Also fair, and worth naming honestly. Someone with irregular income or genuinely tight margins faces a harder version of this math, since the contribution side of the equation is the one lever most directly within someone's control month to month. The crossover point still exists mathematically for smaller, less consistent contributions. It simply arrives later and requires more patience to reach, which doesn't make the underlying mechanism any less real, just slower for some starting positions than others. There's a specific pattern worth naming around how this plays out inside employer retirement accounts specifically, since that's where most people actually experience it first without realizing what they're looking at. A 401k or similar account statement typically shows a single combined balance, contributions, and growth blended together into one number, which is precisely why the crossover point stays invisible by default. Most providers don't separate money you added from money the market added anywhere in the standard account view, meaning the distinction that actually matters has to be calculated manually, something the vast majority of account holders have simply never been prompted to do. There's also a specific pattern worth naming around how raises interact with this math, since it's one of the more useful, practical levers hiding in plain sight. A raise that gets fully absorbed into lifestyle spending doesn't move the crossover point forward at all. Contributions stay flat in real terms even as income climbs. A raise where even a modest share, 10 or 15% of the increase, gets routed directly into the retirement account compounds specifically at the moment a portfolio is best positioned to make use of it, since the base it's landing on has already had years to grow. There's a specific version of this worth naming for anyone holding money across multiple accounts too, since the crossover point can arrive at meaningfully different times depending on where it's calculated. A retirement account, a taxable brokerage account, and a smaller emergency fund each carry their own separate contribution and growth pattern, and combining them into one blended mental total can obscure the fact that the largest, longest-held account may have already crossed its own threshold while a newer account hasn't come close. Running the calculation separately for each meaningful account rather than only on a single combined number often reveals the shift is further along than the total balance alone would suggest. It's worth naming one more honest nuance here too, since it cuts against the tidy, motivational version of this story. Reaching the crossover point doesn't mean someone's financial life becomes worry-free, and treating it as a finish line rather than a genuine but partial shift risks a different kind of disappointment. Housing costs, healthcare, family obligations, none of those pause once a portfolio starts out earning contributions. The honest framing isn't problem solved, it's one significant, real variable now working in your favor that wasn't before, which is genuinely worth something, just not everything. There's a specific timing risk worth naming honestly too, sometimes called sequence risk, since it changes how the crossover point should actually be thought about in practice. A portfolio that crosses the threshold right before a prolonged downturn can temporarily fall back below it, not because the underlying math stopped working, but because a bad multi-year stretch happened to land at an unlucky moment in the sequence. This is exactly why the crossover point works better as a rough zone to watch for over time than a single date to celebrate and then stop paying attention to entirely. The direction is real. The exact timing within any given few years is genuinely not guaranteed. There's also a specific version of this worth naming for people earlier in the process, since the framework can feel discouraging if the current balance is still small. The same math that makes the crossover point feel distant early on is the same math that makes consistent contribution during those early years disproportionately valuable, precisely because that period is when contributions are doing nearly all the work building the base that compounding will eventually take over. Someone 5 years into saving isn't behind some invisible schedule. They're in the exact phase where effort matters most and where quitting would cost the most in terms of delayed compounding down the line. So here's where we land. This crossover point, the moment a portfolio starts out growing its own contributions, isn't some distant milestone reserved for the wealthy. For most consistent savers, it arrives sooner than expected, often quietly, without any dramatic signal announcing it. Priya calculated her own rough crossover estimate, realized she'd likely already crossed it the previous year without noticing, and started routing part of every raise directly into her account instead of her lifestyle, letting the fire that was already burning well on its own get fed a little faster. The goal was never to chase some abstract number that only makes sense on a spreadsheet. It's reaching the point where your money carries a meaningful share of the weight, so you're not the only one pulling. And based on the math, that point is very likely closer than most people let themselves believe, sitting quietly in an account statement most people have never actually looked at closely enough to notice. Calculate your own rough estimate this week, not someday. If this helped, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, have you ever checked your account and had that specific moment where the number honestly didn't feel quite real? I'll see you in the next one.